Some men spend their golden years wondering if their lives mattered at all. Others get a second chance to find out. 56-year-old Eloy Blackhorse was one of those men, living quietly on the edge of a dying frontier town. His warrior days, long behind him. He fed chickens, mended fences, and tried to forget the blood-soaked trails of his past. Then he went to a simple livestock auction and saw something that changed everything. In the holding pen stood a wolf unlike any creature he'd ever seen, taller than a man's waist, with amber eyes that seemed to know his deepest secrets. When Eloy won the bid, the townsfolk whispered of curses and omens, but Eloy felt something different stirring in his chest. This wolf hadn't come by accident, but what was it trying to tell him about his past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Eloy Blackhorse's front porch as he sat with his coffee, watching the world wake up around him. At 56, his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd lived by his wits and his rifle. Though both had grown quiet in recent years, the lines around his dark eyes spoke of countless hours squinting into distant horizons, tracking men who thought the vastness of the frontier could hide their sins. Copper Ridge stretched before him like a town caught between two worlds, the wild past that had forged it and the uncertain future that threatened to swallow it whole. The main street, once busy with cattle drives and mining operations, now hosted more tumbleweeds than travelers. Buildings that had once bustled with merchants and gamblers stood empty, their windows reflecting nothing but sky and memory. In a tin box beneath his bed lay his military discharge papers, yellowed with age and folded along the same creases for 20 years. Staff Sergeant Eloy Blackhorse, Apache Scout, United States Army, decorated for exceptional service in tracking and reconnaissance. The papers told a story of honor, but they couldn't capture the weight of what he'd seen, what he'd lost, or why. He'd finally laid down his rifle and walked away from the only life he'd ever known. The wolf had been with him for 3 days now, and its presence filled spaces in his routine he hadn't realized were empty. It moved through his small homestead with the fluid grace of shadow, never quite where you expected to find it, always aware of everything around it. When Eloy worked in his garden, the wolf watched from the shade of an old cottonwood. When he repaired his fence, the creature paced the perimeter as if standing guard. This morning was no different. As Eloy rose from his chair, the wolf appeared at the edge of the yard, its amber eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. Those eyes, they held a depth that made Eloy's chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite name. Not the simple intelligence of a wild animal, but something older, something that seemed to peer directly into his soul. "Morning, old friend," Eloy murmured, though the wolf was anything but old in appearance. Its coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning light, and every muscle spoke of power barely contained. When it turned those impossible eyes toward him, Eloy felt the familiar stirring, the same instinct that had once made him the most sought-after tracker in 3 territories. The ride into town took 40 minutes along a dirt road that seemed to grow more rutted with each passing year. Copper Ridge clung to life through the sheer stubbornness of the people who remained, folks too proud or too poor to abandon the place their fathers had built. The general store served as the town's heartbeat, where news traveled faster than telegraph wires and gossip seasoned every conversation. Behind the counter, Martha Crowfeather had been dispensing supplies and wisdom for nearly 3 decades. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands could measure flour or count change with equal precision. She looked up as Eloy entered, her knowing smile creasing the corners of her eyes. "Heard you made quite the purchase at the auction," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. In a town this size, news traveled like wildfire, and the mysterious wolf had already become the subject of considerable speculation. "Word travels fast," Eloy replied, selecting a few items from the shelves. Coffee, bacon, flour. Simple provisions. For a simple life. Fast and colourful. Old Pete swears that wolf of yours looked him dead in the eye and knew exactly what he was thinking. Martha's tone carried amusement, but her eyes held something more serious. Course, Pete's been known to exaggerate, especially after a few drinks at the saloon. Doc Henderson chose that moment to push through the store's front door, his medical, bag in hand and exhaustion written across his lined face. At 72, he was the closest thing Copper Ridge had to both physician and philosopher, a man who'd seen enough of life's mysteries to keep an open mind about most things. Eloy. He nodded, then glanced at Martha. Just finished with the Brennan baby, healthy boy, should do just fine. He paused, studying Eloy with the careful attention he usually reserved for symptoms. Heard about your new companion. Unusual circumstances. Unusual times. Eloy replied simply. The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. Been practicing medicine for 47 years, and I've learned that when something doesn't fit the usual patterns, it's worth paying attention to. That wolf, well, let's just say I've never seen anything quite like it in all my years. Sheriff Coleman entered just as Doc Henderson finished speaking, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. At 45, he carried himself with the careful authority of a man who'd learned to choose his battles wisely. His star caught the morning light streaming through the window as he approached the counter. "Morning, folks. Eloy, glad I caught you." The sheriff's tone was friendly but professional. Had a few questions from some travelers passing through. They were asking about unusual animal sightings, specifically large wolves. Seemed mighty interested in your recent purchase. A chill ran down Eloy's spine, though his expression remained neutral. "Travelers, you said." 3 men in a fancy carriage, well-dressed, spoke like they had education and money. Said they were researchers of some kind, but they didn't strike me as the scientific type, if you catch my meaning. Martha's hands stilled over the account book she'd been writing in. Doc Henderson shifted his weight, suddenly alert. In a town like Copper Ridge, strangers asking specific questions usually meant trouble was coming. "What did you tell them?" Eloy asked quietly. "Nothing more than they could see for themselves. That you're a private man who keeps to himself and doesn't cause trouble for anyone." The sheriff met Eloy's eyes directly. "But I got the feeling they already knew more about you than they were letting on." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the store's windows and sending dust devils dancing down the main street. Somewhere in the distance, Eloy could have sworn he heard the low, haunting call of a wolf, though his new companion was back at the homestead, miles away. As he gathered his supplies and prepared to leave, Eloy felt the weight of their collective gaze. These people had been his neighbors for years, respecting his privacy and accepting his quiet presence without question. Now something was stirring, and they could sense it as clearly as approaching storm clouds. "Take care of yourself, Eloy," Martha said, as he reached the door. "And that wolf of yours, something tells me you're both going to need each other in the days ahead." The ride home felt longer than usual, and Eloy found himself scanning the horizon with the old instincts he'd tried so hard to bury. The wolf appeared before he'd even unsaddled his horse, materializing from the shadows as if it had been waiting. Those amber eyes studied him intently, and for a moment Eloy could have sworn he saw understanding there, as if the creature knew exactly what he'd learned in town. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, Eloy sat on his porch with the wolf lying nearby. The animal's presence was both comforting and unsettling, like a door opening to rooms in his memory he'd kept locked for 20 years. Change was coming to Copper Ridge and to his carefully ordered life. Eloy could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd once sensed approaching storms or hostile parties on the trail. The only question now was whether he was ready to face whatever was hunting him, and why this mysterious wolf had appeared just when he needed it most. The wolf's behavior changed on the fourth morning. Instead of its usual patrol around the property, it stood at the edge of Eloy's land, staring into the wilderness beyond with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. When Eloy approached, the creature turned those amber eyes on him with unmistakable purpose. This wasn't an animal asking for food or attention. This was a guide waiting for him to follow. Eloy had spent enough years tracking through hostile territory to recognize when something wanted to show him the way. Against his better judgment, he saddled his horse and gathered his old field gear. The rifle felt foreign in his hands after years of disuse, but muscle memory guided his fingers as he checked the action and loaded the chamber. The wolf led him northeast, toward the Badlands, where red stone cliffs carved jagged silhouettes against the morning sky. They traveled in silence for 3 hours, climbing steadily into country that grew more desolate with each mile. This was Apache land, sacred ground where his people had hidden from cavalry patrols and buried their dead according to ancient custom. When the wolf finally stopped, they stood at the rim of a narrow canyon Eloy remembered all too well. 20 years had passed since he'd last seen this place, but the memories crashed over him like a physical blow. Devil's Canyon, where good men had died and where his faith in the uniform he wore had died with them. The wolf descended into the canyon with sure-footed grace, and Eloy followed on foot, leading his horse down the treacherous slope. At the bottom, among the scattered boulders and scrub brush, the remnants of an old camp lay hidden beneath 2 decades of accumulated dust and debris. Rotted canvas, rusted metal, fragments of equipment that had once belonged to the U.S. Army, and bones, human bones, picked clean by time and scavengers, scattered across the canyon floor like discarded dice. Eloy's throat tightened as he recognized the remnants of cavalry uniforms, the distinctive brass buttons still clinging to faded blue fabric. But it was what the wolf found buried beneath a pile of stones that stopped Eloy's heart cold. Protruding from the dirt, tarnished but unmistakable, was a cavalry badge bearing the name Captain William Hayes, the same man who had led the patrol that was supposed to escort Apache families to the reservation, the same man who had sworn to protect them. The same man Eloy had trusted with his life and the lives of his people. As Eloy's fingers closed around the blood-stained badge, the world around him seemed to shimmer and fade. The wolf watched with those knowing eyes as vision replaced reality. And suddenly, Eloy was no longer a 56-year-old man standing in an empty canyon. He was 36 again, wearing the blue uniform of an army scout, riding beside Captain Hayes on what should have been a routine mission. The vision unfolded with terrible clarity. Hayes had convinced Eloy that they were escorting Apache families to safety, but the captain had his own plans. At Devil's Canyon, Hayes gave the order to stop, not for rest, but for slaughter. The Apache families were unarmed, trusting in the protection the army had promised. When they realized the betrayal, it was too late. Eloy watched himself try to intervene, saw his younger self draw his rifle on his own commanding officer, but Hayes had anticipated this possibility. The other soldiers, hand-picked for their loyalty to their captain rather than their uniform, turned their weapons on Eloy. Only his Apache training had saved him that day. He'd escaped into the rocks, wounded and horrified, leaving behind everyone he'd sworn to protect. The vision showed him what happened next, details his traumatized mind had blocked for 20 years. Hayes methodically searched the bodies, taking jewelry, gold teeth, anything of value. This hadn't been about military necessity or following orders. This had been about robbery and murder, sanctioned by the authority of his rank. But the most devastating revelation came last. Among the dead was an old Apache man, Eloy, recognized, Chief Running Bear, his mentor and spiritual father, who had taught him the ways of both worlds. Running Bear had been carrying something precious that day, a medicine bundle containing sacred items and documents that proved the tribe's legal claim to mineral-rich land near the reservation. Hayes had taken it all. As the vision faded, Eloy found himself on his knees in the dirt, the badge clutched in his trembling hand. The wolf sat beside him, patient and watchful, as if it understood the weight of what had just been revealed. 20 years of believing Hayes had died in an Apache raid. 20 years of guilt for surviving when others hadn't. 20 years of wondering if he could have done something different. Now he knew the truth. Hayes hadn't died that day. He'd orchestrated it all. The Apache raid that supposedly killed him had been a lie, cover for his disappearance with stolen Apache treasure. While Eloy struggled with nightmares and survivor's guilt, Hayes had built a new life somewhere with blood money. The wolf moved closer, pressing its warm flank against Eloy's shoulder. In that moment of contact, another vision flickered through his mind, briefer this time, but no less clear. He saw Running Bear's final moments, saw the old chief hide something in a crevice between the rocks before Hayes found him. A message, a warning, evidence of the betrayal that only Eloy would know how to find. Following the wolf's guidance, Eloy searched among the scattered stones until his fingers found a gap in the canyon wall. Wedged deep in the crevice was an oilcloth bundle preserved by the dry desert air. Inside was a letter written in Running Bear's careful English, along with photographs and documents that made Eloy's blood run cold. "My son," the letter began, using the Apache term for spiritual kinship. "If you are reading this, then the spirits have found a way to bring you back to this cursed place. Hayes is not what he seems. He has been planning this betrayal for months, meeting with men who covet our sacred lands for the silver that runs beneath them. I have proof of his crimes, but I fear I will not live to deliver it. The wolf you have been dreaming of will come. When the time is right, trust it as you once trusted me." The photographs showed Hayes in secret meetings with well-dressed white men, their faces clear despite the passage of time. Business documents detailed plans for mining operations on Apache land, contingent on the removal of the tribes. And there were letters, correspondence between Hayes and powerful men in Washington, discussing the best methods for eliminating the Apache problem permanently. Eloy's hands shook as he read Running Bear's final words. "Hayes lives, my son. He has grown rich on our people's blood and now wears the clothes of a respectable man. But the spirits demand justice, and you are their instrument. The wolf will guide you to what you must do." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, Eloy finally understood. The wolf hadn't come to him by chance. It was a messenger sent by spirits he'd stopped believing in years ago. Running Bear's medicine bundle had been more than just sacred objects. It had been a summoning call, reaching across death to demand justice for crimes left unpunished. The ride home passed in contemplative silence, Eloy's mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to face. Hayes was alive somewhere, probably wealthy and respected, his crimes buried with his victims. The wolf trotted alongside his horse, no longer mysterious but purposeful, its amber eyes reflecting a mission that had waited 20 years for completion. That night, Eloy couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, staring up at stars that seemed dimmer than usual, while the wolf kept vigil beside him. In his hands, he turned the blood-stained badge over and over, feeling its weight like an accusation. The peaceful life he'd built was crumbling, replaced by a calling he'd tried to forget but could no longer deny. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to bury the past once more or follow the wolf toward a reckoning that terrified and compelled him in equal measure. Sleep refused to come that night. Eloy sat in his kitchen chair, watching shadows dance across the walls while his mind wrestled with memories that felt both foreign and familiar. The blood-stained badge lay on the table before him, catching moonlight through the window like a silver accusation. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Running Bear's weathered face, heard the old chief's voice speaking words of guidance from beyond death itself. By dawn, exhaustion had settled into his bones, but with it came a grim clarity. He couldn't pretend the past was buried anymore. The wolf had seen to that, appearing at his door like some ancient judgment made flesh. As morning light filtered through his windows, Eloy made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of what lay ahead. The wolf appeared as he stepped onto his porch, materializing from the shadows as if it had been waiting for his decision. Those amber eyes held no judgment, only patient expectation. It knew somehow that the revelation in Devil's Canyon had changed everything. "All right, old friend," Eloy murmured, reaching into his pocket to touch the tattered medicine pouch he'd carried since boyhood. Running Bear had given it to him during his vision quest at 16, filled with sacred herbs and small objects meant to strengthen his connection to the spirit world. He'd forgotten its power during the years of military service, but now it seemed to pulse with warmth against his fingers. "I reckon you know what comes next better than I do." The ride into Copper Ridge felt different this morning. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound carried the possibility of danger. The wolf ranged ahead, its massive form moving through the brush with supernatural grace, always alert, always watchful. At the general store, Martha looked up from her inventory with concern etched across her features. "You look like you've been wrestling with demons, Eloy. Everything all right?" Before he could answer, the door chimed and a young woman entered, her arms full of books and papers. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with intelligent green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her dress marked her as an outsider, too fine for ranch work, too practical for pure city living. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Martha with polite determination. "I'm looking for information about local Apache history. I was told you might be able to help me." Her voice carried the cultured accent of Eastern education, but her manner suggested someone accustomed to getting her hands dirty in pursuit of knowledge. Martha's eyes flicked to Eloy, then back to the stranger. "Depends on what kind of information you're seeking, Miss." "Jane Morrison," the woman replied quickly. "I'm a historian from the Smithsonian Institution, researching indigenous peoples of the Southwest for a comprehensive study. Specifically, I'm interested in events that occurred in this area during the 1870s and 1880s. Eloy felt his pulse quicken. The timing was too convenient, the subject too specific. His instincts, honed by years of survival, whispered warnings. But something in the woman's earnest expression gave him pause. If she was connected to his enemies, she was either an exceptional actress or genuinely unaware of her role. "Might I ask, what brings a Smithsonian historian to Copper Ridge?" Eloy's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes missed nothing about her reaction. Jane turned to face him fully, and he caught a flicker of recognition in her expression before she composed herself. "You must be Mr. Blackhorse. I was hoping to speak with you, actually. Your reputation as someone knowledgeable about Apache culture preceded you." The admission confirmed his suspicions, but her directness was either refreshingly honest or cleverly calculated. "My reputation is vastly exaggerated, Miss Morrison. I'm just a man trying to live quietly." "Perhaps," she said, pulling a folder from her collection of papers, "but these documents suggest otherwise." She opened the folder to reveal old military reports, faded but legible. Eloy's own name appeared multiple times, along with commendations for his service as an Apache scout. Martha had gone very still behind the counter, her weathered hands resting on the surface as she listened to the exchange. Doc Henderson chose that moment to enter, his medical bag in hand and curiosity plain on his face. "Miss Morrison," Jane continued, "I've spent months researching military operations in this region, particularly incidents involving Apache tribes during the reservation. There are significant gaps in the official records, discrepancies that suggest important events were either classified or deliberately omitted. Eloy's throat felt dry, but he kept his expression impassive. History is written by those in power. Miss Morrison, sometimes the truth gets lost. Exactly my point, she said, leaning forward with scholarly enthusiasm. I've found evidence of at least 3 major incidents that were never properly documented. One in particular, a patrol that was supposed to escort Apache families to the reservation, but never arrived. The official report claimed they were killed in a raid, but witness accounts don't match the military version. The medicine pouch seemed to burn against Eloy's chest. Running Bear had been right. The spirits worked through many agents, and this earnest young historian might be one of them. But he needed to be certain of her intentions before revealing anything. Witness accounts can be unreliable, he said carefully. People see what they expect to see, remember what they want to remember. Jane's eyes sharpened with intelligence. True, but when multiple independent sources describe the same events, patterns emerge. For instance, several accounts mention an Apache scout who survived an incident at a place called Devil's Canyon, a man who tried to protect the families under his care and was nearly killed for his efforts. Doc Henderson cleared his throat softly. Martha's knuckles had gone white where she gripped the counter. The air in the store felt charged with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. That's a serious accusation, Eloy said quietly. Suggesting military personnel committed crimes against those they were sworn to protect. Not an accusation, Jane corrected. A question that deserves investigation. I have correspondence that suggests some officers were involved in land speculation. Schemes, using their authority to acquire valuable territory through questionable means. The wolf's presence seemed to pulse in Eloy's consciousness, even though the animal waited outside. He could feel its amber eyes watching, waiting for his decision. Trust was a luxury he'd abandoned years ago, but something about Jane Morrison's determined pursuit of truth resonated with the justice Running Bear had demanded. "Why does this matter to you?" he asked. "These events happened decades ago. The people involved are likely dead or beyond reach of earthly justice." Jane's expression grew solemn. "Because truth matters, Mr. Blackhorse. Because the families who died deserve to be remembered accurately. And because I've recently discovered evidence suggesting at least one of the responsible parties may still be alive and still profiting from his crimes." The words hit Eloy like a physical blow, confirming what Running Bear's letter had revealed. Hayes was alive somewhere, living well on blood money, while his victims lay forgotten in an unmarked canyon grave. What kind of evidence? The question escaped before he could stop it, betraying more interest than he'd intended to show. Jane glanced around the store, noting the intense attention of everyone present. The kind that might be dangerous for a lone researcher to pursue without help. The kind that might explain why I've been followed since leaving Denver 3 days ago. Martha's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Doc Henderson set his bag down carefully, his healer's instincts recognizing serious trouble, and Eloy felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The same choice he'd faced 20 years ago between safety and duty. Outside, a wolf's howl drifted across the morning air, distant but unmistakable. Jane's eyes widened in recognition of the sound, and Eloy realized she knew more about his situation than she'd initially revealed. The past was catching up with him whether he wanted it to or not. The only question now was whether he would meet it as a warrior or as a man still running from ghosts. The conversation in Martha's store ended when Sheriff Coleman pushed through the door, his expression grim and purposeful. His badge caught the morning light as he surveyed the gathered group, lingering longest on Jane Morrison with the careful attention of a lawman who'd learned not to trust coincidences. "Miss Morrison, I presume," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast in a small town. Folks are saying you've been asking questions about old Apache troubles." Jane straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm conducting legitimate historical research, Sheriff. Is there some problem with that?" Depends on who's interested in your research, Coleman replied. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a telegraph message, its yellow surface worn from handling. Got this from the Territorial Marshal's office this morning. Seems there are some powerful people who'd prefer certain historical events stay buried. Eloy felt his chest tighten as the sheriff handed him the telegram. The message was brief but chilling. Stop interference with Morrison research. Official business. Cooperation expected. W. Hayes, Territorial Land Commissioner. The name hit him like a physical blow. Hayes wasn't just alive. He held a position of authority with the power to make problems disappear. The wolf's instincts had been correct. Dangerous forces were already in motion. William Hayes, Eloy said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made Doc Henderson look up sharply. A Territorial Land Commissioner. Jane's eyes widened with recognition. You know him. Before Eloy could answer, Martha moved to the window, her movements sharp with alarm. 3 riders coming up the main street, she announced. Same men who were asking questions yesterday, and they're not looking friendly. The wolf materialized from nowhere, padding through the store's open door with supernatural silence. Its amber eyes swept the room, cataloguing threats with ancient intelligence, before settling on Eloy with unmistakable urgency. Several customers who had been browsing the shelves suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. Back room, Martha said firmly, gesturing toward the storage area behind the counter. All of you, this conversation isn't for public consumption. As they moved toward shelter, Eloy caught Jane's arm gently. Miss Morrison, you need to understand what you've stumbled into. This isn't just historical research anymore. Hayes has spent 20 years building his reputation and fortune on crimes he thinks are buried. Men like that don't hesitate to eliminate threats. Jane's jaw set with determination that reminded him of Apache women he'd known. Fierce, uncompromising, willing to face danger for what they believed. Then we need to make sure the truth comes to light before he can stop us. The wolf positioned itself near the door, every muscle tense with readiness. Outside, Eloy could hear the creak of saddle leather and the low murmur of voices as the riders approached. Through the window, he glimpsed 3 hard-faced men in expensive clothes, the kind of professionals who asked questions with bullets rather than words. Doc Henderson moved to Jane's side, his healer's instincts extending to protection, as well as medicine. Young lady, I've been practicing in frontier towns for 4 decades. I've seen what happens when powerful men decide someone knows too much. You should consider leaving while you still can. I can't, Jane replied, her voice steady despite the danger. I have evidence that could expose crimes stretching back decades. Land fraud, murder, conspiracy. Hayes has been systematically destroying Apache claims to mineral-rich territory. If I walk away now, he wins. Sheriff Coleman checked his sidearm discreetly. What kind of evidence? Jane opened her satchel, revealing a collection of documents that made Eloy's breath catch. Among them were photographs he recognized from running. Bear's hidden cache, along with newer materials that painted a picture of ongoing corruption, financial records showing mysterious land acquisitions after Apache incidents, she explained quickly. Correspondence between Hayes and mining interests. Witness statements from survivors of attacks that were blamed on Apache raids, but were actually cover for land grabs. The front door's bell chimed as heavy footsteps entered the store. Martha's voice carried clearly from the main room, polite but firm. Gentlemen, how can I help you today? A gravelly voice responded. Looking for a young woman? Eastern type? Been asking questions about Apache history. Heard she might be shopping here. Lots of people shop here, Martha replied evenly. You'll have to be more specific. Through the thin wall, Eloy could hear the men moving around the store, their spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The wolf's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. Its supernatural nature was becoming impossible to ignore. No ordinary animal moved with such perfect stealth or displayed such human-like understanding of complex situations. We know she's here, another voice said. Younger, but equally menacing. Her horse is tied up outside. Now, we can do this easy or hard, but she's coming with us either way. Jane's hand moved instinctively to a small derringer hidden in her skirts, practical protection for a woman traveling alone in dangerous country. But Eloy caught her wrist gently, shaking his head. 3 professional gunmen were too many for a group of shopkeepers and scholars, no matter how determined they might be. "There's another way," he whispered, his Apache training asserting itself after years of dormancy. The back of Martha's store connected to an alley that led to the livery stable. If they moved carefully, they could escape while the men focused on the main room. But as they prepared to slip away, the wolf suddenly raised its massive head, amber eyes fixed on something beyond their vision. A low growl rumbled in its chest, not aggression, but warning. Something else was coming, something that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The sound of approaching horses reached them seconds later, multiple riders moving fast down the main street. Through the window, Eloy saw Sheriff Coleman's deputies arriving with rifles ready, along with several townsmen he recognized as veterans of frontier conflicts. Word had spread through Copper Ridge with the efficiency of a small community that looked after its own. "Seems like your friends picked the wrong town to threaten folks in," Martha called out loudly, her voice carrying clear satisfaction. "Sheriff, these gentlemen were just asking about Miss Morrison here." The dynamic in the main room shifted immediately. Outnumbered and outgunned, Hayes's men found themselves in an untenable position. Eloy heard rapid whispered conversation, then the sound of retreat. Boots moving quickly toward the door, followed by the jangle of bridles and the thunder of hoofbeats as the riders departed. But the wolf's warning proved prophetic. Through Jane's documents, Eloy now understood the true scope of Hayes's operation. This wasn't just about past crimes, it was about an ongoing conspiracy that reached into territorial government and beyond. The attack on Jane had been desperate and premature, revealing just how much Hayes had to lose. "He'll try again," Eloy said quietly as they emerged from hiding. "Men like Hayes don't give up when they're cornered. They get more dangerous." Jane nodded, her scholarly determination now tempered with hard-won understanding of the risks involved. "Then we need to move fast. I have contacts in Washington who can act on this evidence, but only if we can get it to them safely." The wolf padded over to Eloy, pressing its warm flank against his leg in a gesture of support and readiness. In that moment of contact, another vision flashed through his mind, brief but clear. He saw Hayes as he was now, older, prosperous, respected, but still carrying the same cold cruelty that had made him a killer 20 years ago. The past had finally caught up with both of them. But this time, Eloy wouldn't be caught unprepared. This time he had allies, evidence, and something he'd lost in Devil's Canyon, the absolute certainty that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its mark. The wolf's amber eyes reflected that same certainty, ancient and implacable as the desert itself. That evening, Eloy found himself moving through routines he hadn't practiced in 20 years. Behind his small cabin, in a clearing hidden from casual view, he worked methodically to restore skills that had once made him legendary among military scouts. The wolf watched from the shadows, its presence both encouraging and expectant, as if it understood that preparation for war required dedication to forgotten disciplines. His body remembered more than his mind had allowed him to believe. The old Apache exercises Running Bear had taught him, movements that built strength, flexibility, and the fluid grace necessary for survival in hostile territory, came back with surprising ease. His muscles protested at first, soft from years of peaceful living, but determination drove him past discomfort towards something approaching his former capability. Jane had agreed to stay at Doc Henderson's house, where the physician could provide both protection and medical attention if needed. Her evidence was too valuable to risk, and her presence in town had already drawn unwanted attention from Hayes' operatives. But even hidden away, she continued her research, cross-referencing historical documents with territorial land records. to build an unshakable case against her quarry. The wolf's demonstration of supernatural intelligence had occurred during Jane's second day in hiding. A rattlesnake, disturbed from its afternoon rest by her presence in Doc's garden, had coiled to strike when the massive creature appeared from nowhere. Instead of attacking the serpent, the wolf had fixed it with those amber eyes, holding the venomous reptile motionless until Jane could back away safely. Then, with what could only be described as dismissive authority, it had sent the snake slithering away into the desert. Doc Henderson, witnessing the encounter from his kitchen window, had abandoned any pretense that the wolf was merely an unusually large wild animal. 47 years of practicing medicine, he told Eloy that evening, and I've never seen anything that defied natural law quite so casually. That creature of yours, it's something else entirely. Meanwhile, Martha and Sheriff Coleman had quietly spread the word through Copper Ridge's network of long-time residents. These were people who remembered the Apache Wars, who had lost friends and family to the conflicts that had raged across the territory for decades. When they learned that one of the men responsible for prolonging that bloodshed was still alive and profiting from his crimes, their response was swift and unified. Old Pete, despite his reputation for tall tales and excessive drinking, proved to have connections throughout the territory's mining camps. Within 2 days, he'd confirmed that Hayes owned significant interests in 3 major silver operations, all located on land that had once been promised to Apache tribes. The pattern was clear: systematic theft disguised as legitimate business development, but it was Martha who provided the most crucial intelligence. Her late husband had worked as a freight hauler during the territorial period, carrying supplies and messages between remote settlements. Among his papers, preserved in a trunk she hadn't opened in years, were invoices and receipts that documented Hayes's early business dealings. The dates aligned perfectly with the massacre at Devil's Canyon and other suspicious incidents. He wasn't just stealing Apache land, she explained, as they gathered in the back room of her store after closing time. He was using his military position to identify the most valuable claims, then arranging for the tribes to be removed permanently. The official reports always blamed Apache aggression, but the pattern shows deliberate targeting. Jane spread her accumulated evidence across Martha's work table like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Financial records, military reports, witness statements, and physical evidence formed a comprehensive picture of corruption that spanned decades. But the centerpiece remained the blood-stained cavalry badge Eloy had retrieved from Devil's Canyon, along with Running Bear's hidden letter detailing the conspiracy. "We have enough to destroy him," Jane said with quiet satisfaction. "Multiple federal crimes, territorial corruption, conspiracy charges that could reach into Washington itself. But we need to move carefully. Hayes has spent 20 years building. Political connections and desperate men in powerful positions can be extremely dangerous." The truth of her words became evident the following morning, when Sheriff Coleman arrived at Eloy's cabin with disturbing news. During the night, 3 separate homesteads on the outskirts of town had reported strange visitors, well-dressed men asking detailed questions about the residents, their routines, and their relationships with Eloy Blackhorse. Their mapping the community, Eloy realized, his military experience providing unwelcome insight into enemy tactics. Identifying potential allies, looking for leverage points, preparing for a coordinated operation. The wolf emerged from the cabin's interior, where it had been resting near the fireplace like some ancient guardian spirit. Its amber eyes swept the horizon with predatory alertness, and Eloy felt that familiar tingle of supernatural awareness. Something was approaching, multiple somethings, moving with purpose toward Copper Ridge. His instincts proved correct when Martha arrived an hour later. Her usually composed demeanor cracked with worry. "Riders approaching from 3 directions," she reported. "Professional men armed and moving like they know exactly where they're going. Word is they're asking for you by name." The time for subtlety had passed. Hayes had decided to handle the problem with direct action rather than political maneuvering, which meant the situation had escalated beyond simple intimidation. These wouldn't be local troublemakers or hired thugs. They would be experienced killers, men accustomed to making problems disappear permanently. In the clearing behind his cabin, Eloy retrieved the ancient Apache war lance that Running Bear had hidden years before his death. The wolf had led him to it 3 days earlier, guiding him to a spot where the earth felt somehow different beneath his feet. The weapon lay wrapped in oiled leather, preserved by desert air and spiritual protection, its obsidian point still, sharp enough to pierce steel. As his fingers closed around the lance's wooden shaft, another vision struck him with overwhelming force. He saw Running Bear as a young warrior, wielding this same weapon against cavalry charges during the Apache Wars. He saw the old chief's final battle, his desperate attempt to protect tribal families from Hayes's treachery, and he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he was meant to be, the instrument of justice that Running Bear had trained him to become. The weight of the lance felt perfect in his hands, balanced and deadly, connecting him to generations of Apache warriors who had fought against impossible odds for their people's survival. But this wasn't about tribal warfare anymore. It was about honor, justice, and the price of crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. "He's coming himself," Jane announced, arriving breathless from her lookout post at Doc Henderson's house. "I saw him through the field glasses, older but unmistakable. William Hayes, riding with at least a dozen armed men approaching from the main road. The confrontation Eloy had avoided for 20 years was finally upon him. But this time he wouldn't face it as a traumatized survivor haunted by failure and guilt. This time he would meet his enemy as an Apache warrior, guided by ancient wisdom and supernatural alliance. The wolf padded to his side, its massive presence radiating readiness for whatever was to come. Those amber eyes held no trace of fear, only the calm certainty of predators who had waited patiently for their prey to finally come within range. Running Bear's spirit seemed to whisper through the desert wind. "The circle closes, my son. The debts of the past come due at last." William Hayes arrived in Copper Ridge like a man accustomed to owning whatever ground his boots touched. At 63, he cut an impressive figure, silver-haired, well-dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of prosperity and position. His bearing remained military despite the civilian clothes, and his pale eyes held the same cold calculation Eloy remembered from their shared service 20 years ago. But time had softened him in subtle ways. His movements lacked the fluid readiness of a soldier, and his hands bore the manicured smoothness of a man who hadn't gripped a weapon in anger for decades. The dozen armed men who accompanied him were professionals, but they rode with the confidence of hunters who had never encountered truly dangerous prey. They made camp at the edge of town, establishing a perimeter that spoke of military training while maintaining the pretense of legitimate business. Hayes himself took rooms at the hotel, presenting himself as a territorial official investigating irregularities in historical land claims. To most of the townspeople, he appeared exactly as he intended, a respectable government representative, conducting routine business. Only a few recognized the predator beneath the civilized veneer. "I remember him from the old days," Martha confided as she watched from her store window. "He had that same smile then, the kind that never reached his eyes. Made my skin crawl every time he came through town." Eloy spent the morning in the sacred place Running Bear had shown him in visions, a hidden canyon where Apache warriors had prepared for battle for countless generations. The wolf led him to pools of clay mixed with minerals from the sacred earth, materials his people had used for centuries to paint symbols of power and protection on their bodies before warfare. As he applied the traditional war paint, lines of white clay across his cheekbones, symbols of the wolf spirit on his forehead, the mark of Running Bear's clan on his chest, Eloy felt the last vestiges of his peaceful existence falling away. The man who had fed chickens and mended fences was disappearing, replaced by something older and infinitely more dangerous. The confrontation came at midday, when Hayes finally grew tired of subtle maneuvering. He arrived at Martha's store with 2 bodyguards, his polished boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk with deliberate authority. The few townspeople on the street found urgent business elsewhere, leaving the main thoroughfare eerily quiet. "Miss Morrison," Hayes called out pleasantly as he pushed through the door. "I believe we have business to discuss." Jane emerged from the back room with Doc Henderson beside her, her chin raised defiantly despite the obvious danger. Martha positioned herself behind the counter, her weathered hands resting near a shotgun Eloy knew she wouldn't hesitate to use. "Mr. Hayes," Jane replied with scholarly composure that masked her racing heart, "I wondered when you'd show yourself. Your reputation preceded you, though I suspect the official version differs considerably from the truth." Hayes smiled, the same cold expression that had chilled Eloy's blood decades ago. "Young lady, you've been pursuing dangerous lines of inquiry. Historical research can be a treacherous field, especially when it ventures into areas that are better left undisturbed. Is that a threat, Commissioner?" "An observation. The frontier was a violent place, full of tragic misunderstandings. Sometimes the official records are incomplete simply because the truth was too painful to preserve." Doc Henderson stepped forward, his healer's instincts extending to protection of those under his care. "Miss Morrison is under my medical supervision, Commissioner. Any business you have with her can wait until she's fully recovered from her travels." Hayes's pale eyes shifted to the elderly physician with amused contempt. "Doctor, I'm afraid this matter falls under territorial jurisdiction. Your concerns, while touching, are irrelevant." The tension in the store reached a breaking point when Sheriff Coleman entered, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Commissioner Hayes, I wasn't aware you planned to conduct official business in my jurisdiction without consulting local authorities." "Sheriff," Hayes nodded with mock courtesy. "I assumed professional courtesy would ensure cooperation. We're investigating potentially treasonous activities, the theft and misrepresentation of government documents related to territorial security." It was then that Eloy made his entrance. He appeared in the doorway like a figure from nightmare and legend combined, war paint stark against weathered skin, the ancient lance held with casual deadliness, the massive wolf padding silently beside him. The transformation was so complete that even those who knew him well felt a chill of recognition. This was no longer the quiet homesteader they'd shared meals with for years. This was an Apache warrior in the full flower of his terrible purpose. Hayes went rigid with shock, his composed facade cracking as 20 years of carefully buried memories came flooding back. The bodyguards reached for their weapons, then froze as the wolf's amber eyes fixed on them with predatory intensity. "Hello, William," Eloy said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made the store's windows seem to vibrate. "It's been a long time." "Eloy Blackhorse," Hayes managed, his politician's composure struggling to reassert itself. "I heard you'd settled in this area, living quietly from what I understand." "I was. Until recently." Eloy stepped into the store, the lances, obsidian point catching light like frozen fire. "Until I found some old friends in Devil's Canyon. They had interesting stories to tell." Hayes's face went pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I know exactly what I've discovered." Eloy's interruption carried the finality of judgment. "Running Bear's letter, the photographs, the evidence you thought died with everyone who witnessed your crimes." The wolf moved closer to Hayes's bodyguards, its supernatural size becoming impossible to ignore in the confined space. One of the men whispered a prayer in Spanish, his hand trembling on his gun butt. "You've been busy these 20 years, Eloy continued conversationally. "Built quite a reputation for yourself. Territorial Land Commissioner. That's a position with real authority. Must be useful for someone in your line of work." Hayes straightened, attempting to regain control of the situation. Whatever fevered imaginings you've constructed, 3 silver mines on former Apache land, mining rights, acquired mysteriously after tribal incidents, a pattern of violence that always seemed to benefit the same group of investors. Eloy's voice remained calm, but everyone in the room could feel the fury burning beneath the surface. You turn massacre into a business model. Jane stepped forward, her scholar's courage overcoming fear. We have documentation going back 20 years, Commissioner. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements. The pattern is unmistakable. Hayes's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold killer beneath the civilized exterior. You have nothing that would stand up in any legitimate court. Accusations from a disgraced Apache scout and a hysterical female academic. The lance moved so quickly that it seemed to appear at Hayes's throat without crossing the intervening space. The wolf's growl filled the store like distant thunder, and both bodyguards found themselves staring down the barrel of Sheriff Coleman's rifle. "Choose your words more carefully," Eloy said softly. "The spirits of the dead are listening, and they've grown tired of waiting for justice." In the sudden silence that followed, everyone in the room could hear the truth hanging in the air, like smoke from a signal fire. Hayes had built his fortune on blood and betrayal, but his crimes had finally caught up with him. The only question now was whether justice would be delivered by earthly courts or by older, more implacable forces. The wolf's amber eyes reflected that ancient certainty, patient as stone but inexorable as the turning of seasons. The time for running and hiding was over. The reckoning Running Bear had prophesied was finally at hand. That night, as shadows gathered around Eloy's cabin like gathering storm clouds, the wolf revealed the full scope of its supernatural nature. What began as a simple gesture, the creature padding over to rest its massive head on Eloy's knee, transformed into something that transcended the boundaries between physical and spiritual worlds. The moment of contact sent visions cascading through Eloy's consciousness, like water through a broken dam. But these weren't fragmented glimpses of memory or prophetic flashes of possibility. This was direct communion with something ancient and eternal, a consciousness that had watched over Apache people since the first warrior learned to track prey. "Across endless desert, I am Running Bear's final gift to you." The voice spoke directly into his mind, carrying the weight of countless generations. Spirit guide, protector, instrument of justice that spans both worlds. I have waited 20 years for you to accept your destiny. The revelation struck Eloy with overwhelming force. The wolf wasn't simply an unusually intelligent animal. It was a manifestation of Apache spiritual power, sent by ancestors who refused to let crimes against their people go unpunished. Running Bear's medicine bundle hadn't just contained evidence of Hayes's betrayal. It had been a summoning device, calling forth supernatural assistance when earthly justice proved inadequate. "Your people called you many names during the dark years," the spirit continued. "Scout, tracker, survivor. But your true purpose was always this, to be the living bridge between the worlds of the ancestors and the world of the living. To carry out justice when the laws of men fail." As the visions deepened, Eloy saw the true extent of Hayes's crimes. The massacre at Devil's Canyon had been only the beginning, a test run for a systematic campaign of theft and murder that had continued for 2 decades. Sacred burial grounds had been desecrated for their mineral wealth. Ancient Apache villages had been discovered by prospectors who arrived with suspiciously accurate maps. Tribal families had vanished during routine relocations, their assigned lands subsequently sold to Hayes's business associates. But the most devastating revelation came last. Among Hayes's victims had been Eloy's own father, Chief Joseph Blackhorse, who had died not in battle as Eloy had been told, but in a deliberate ambush orchestrated by Hayes when the tribal leader refused to sign away mineral rights. The official report had blamed a chance encounter with hostile warriors, but the truth was far more sinister. "Your father knew his death was approaching," the spirit guide revealed. "He sent word to Running Bear, asking that his son be prepared for the vengeance that would someday be required. Every lesson you learned, every skill you developed, every moment of training, all of it was preparation for this confrontation." The weight of destiny settled on Eloy's shoulders like an ancestral cloak passed down through generations. He had spent 20 years believing himself a failure, a survivor haunted by his inability to save those under his protection. Now he understood that everything, the massacre, his survival, even his years of guilty exile, had been part of a larger pattern guided by forces beyond human comprehension. Jane arrived at dawn with news that confirmed the supernatural revelations. During her night of research in Doc Henderson's house, she had uncovered the final pieces of Hayes's criminal empire. The territorial land commissioner wasn't just stealing Apache property. He was part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "It's worse than we imagined," she reported, spreading documents across Eloy's kitchen table while the wolf watched with knowing eyes. "Hayes has been systematically destroying Apache claims to force federal intervention. Every Indian uprising in the territory for the past 15 years was actually a manufactured crisis designed to justify military action against specific tribes." The evidence was overwhelming. Forged reports of Apache raids that corresponded exactly with valuable mineral surveys. Military operations that coincidentally opened prime real estate for Hayes's associates. A network of corruption that used the army itself as an instrument of organized crime. "He's not just a land grabber," Jane continued with academic precision, masking moral outrage. "He's been committing genocide for profit, using his government position to eliminate entire Apache communities that stood in the way of his business ventures." But the most chilling discovery was Hayes's current project. Among his papers, Jane had found preliminary surveys for a massive mining operation in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, land that was still home to the last free Apache bands in the territory. The plan called for complete pacification of the region, a euphemism that made its true meaning horrifyingly clear. "He's planning another massacre," Eloy realized, his warrior's instincts recognizing the tactical preparations. Multiple sites, coordinated timing, designed to look like separate incidents. He's going to wipe out every remaining Apache community that poses a threat to his operation. The wolf raised its massive head, amber eyes reflecting supernatural knowledge of events yet to unfold. In that gaze, Eloy saw confirmation of what his spirit guide had already revealed. This wasn't just about punishing past crimes, but preventing future atrocities on an unimaginable scale. "The ancestors chose you, not for vengeance, but for protection," the voice whispered in his mind. "Hayes must be stopped not just for what he has done, but for what he plans to do. You are the only one who can prevent the final destruction of our people." As the morning sun climbed higher, bringing word that Hayes had departed Copper Ridge with his men, Eloy finally understood the true scope of his mission. The evidence Jane had gathered would expose Hayes's past crimes, but bureaucratic justice moved slowly. By the time federal investigators could act, hundreds more Apache families would be dead, their land appropriated by Hayes's criminal network. The wolf padded to the door, looking back with expectant intelligence. Its message was clear: the time for preparation was over. Hayes was moving toward his final target, confident that his crimes would remain hidden behind official reports and manufactured justifications. But he hadn't counted on supernatural intervention, or on the possibility that one of his oldest victims had finally accepted his role as instrument of ancestral justice. "Running Bear's spirit watches over this place," the wolf's voice echoed in Eloy's consciousness, "but his work is not finished until Hayes pays for every life he has stolen. The ancestors demand blood for blood, justice for justice. Are you ready to become what they need you to be? Eloy looked down at the war paint still, marking his skin, at the ancient lance that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy, at the evidence of crimes that cried out for resolution. 20 years of guilt and self-doubt fell away like discarded clothes, replaced by the terrible clarity of purpose his people had always known would come. The Apache warrior Running Bear had trained was finally ready to fulfill his destiny. But first, he had to catch up with a killer who thought the desert was big enough to hide his sins forever. The wolf's howl split the morning air, not a call to the pack, but a declaration of war that seemed to echo across the spiritual realm itself. The hunt was beginning, and this time there would be no escape for William Hayes. The sacred bundle of evidence that Running Bear had assembled over his lifetime lay spread across the table in Doc Henderson's back room, each document a testament to decades of meticulous preparation for this moment. The old chief had anticipated Hayes's eventual exposure, gathering proof with the patience of a spider spinning an inescapable web. Jane worked feverishly to catalogue and preserve the materials, her scholarly training serving a higher purpose than academic research. Among Running Bear's papers were photographs of secret meetings, copies of forged government documents, and testimonies from Apache survivors who had witnessed Hayes's crimes firsthand. Most damning of all were the financial records showing systematic transfers of mineral-rich land from Apache ownership to Hayes's business associates. This isn't just evidence of past crimes, she explained, as Eloy studied the documents with growing comprehension. It's a complete blueprint of his operations. Running Bear understood Hayes' methods well enough to predict his future targets. The prediction had proved horrifyingly accurate. Hayes's current expedition was heading toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the last independent Apache communities had sought refuge in terrain too hostile for casual military operations. According to the documents, Hayes had spent months preparing for what he called the final solution to the Apache problem, language that made Eloy's blood run cold with its implications. But Running Bear's greatest gift wasn't the evidence itself. It was the tactical intelligence he had gathered about Hayes' weaknesses. The old chief had studied his enemy with the same intensity Hayes had once applied to hunting Apache families, learning patterns of behavior that could be exploited when the time for confrontation finally arrived. "He's arrogant," Eloy observed, reading between the lines of Running Bear's careful notes. "Success has made him careless. He believes his political connections make him untouchable, so he's stopped taking proper precautions." The wolf raised its massive head from where it had been resting, amber eyes reflecting supernatural awareness of approaching events. Through their spiritual connection, Eloy felt a surge of information. Not words, but direct knowledge of Hayes's current position, his intentions, and the timeline that would determine whether justice arrived in time to prevent another massacre. Martha arrived with news that confirmed the wolf's supernatural intelligence. Her network of contacts throughout the territory had tracked Hayes's movements with the efficiency of a military reconnaissance operation. "He's moving fast toward Apache Canyon," she reported. "Picked up more men at Fort Davidson. Mercenaries, not regular army. They're equipped for extended operations in hostile terrain." Sheriff Coleman nodded grimly. "Got word from the territorial marshal's office. Hayes has authorization for enforcement operations against hostile Apache elements. Official backing for whatever he's planning to do up there." The scope of the corruption was staggering. Hayes had transformed the entire territorial government into an instrument of his criminal enterprise, using official channels to legitimize genocide. But Running Bear had anticipated this possibility, as well, preparing counter-moves that would expose the conspiracy at its highest levels. Among the evidence was correspondence with federal officials in Washington, men who had grown suspicious of Hayes's methods but lacked proof of wrongdoing. Jane immediately began drafting telegrams that would alert these allies to the immediate danger, coordinating a response that could reach Hayes's superiors before his final operation began. But bureaucratic intervention would take days, possibly weeks, to organize. The Apache families in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains didn't have that kind of time. Hayes was moving with the confidence of a man who had never faced serious opposition, expecting to complete his work and present Washington with another accomplished fact, disguised as necessary military action. "We have to stop him ourselves," Eloy realized, studying maps of the mountain region where his people had taken refuge. Federal authorities can deal with the political consequences later, but someone has to prevent the immediate slaughter. The wolf padded to his side, pressing its warm flank against his leg in a gesture of support and readiness. In that moment of contact, Eloy felt the full weight of ancestral guidance flowing through him, not just Running Bear's spirit, but generations of Apache warriors who had fought impossible odds to protect their people. Doc Henderson, despite his age and peaceful profession, stepped forward with quiet determination. "You won't be going alone. This town has watched Hayes's men threaten our people and our values. We're not about to let him complete his genocide while we stand by and do nothing." The declaration sparked something in the gathered townspeople that transcended simple moral outrage. These were frontier folk who had built their community through mutual support and collective resistance to outside threats. Hayes represented everything they had struggled against: corruption, violence, the abuse of power against those too weak to defend themselves. Within hours, a plan began to take shape. Sheriff Coleman would coordinate with territorial authorities to ensure Hayes faced legal consequences for his crimes. Jane would manage the evidence and communications with federal officials. Martha would organize the town's resources to support the rescue operation, and Eloy would do what he had been trained to do since childhood: track his enemy through hostile territory and deliver the justice that civilized society had failed to provide. The wolf led him to the place where Running Bear had hidden his final cache of weapons and supplies. In a cave system that had sheltered Apache warriors for centuries, Eloy found everything he would need for the confrontation ahead: modern rifles and ammunition, traditional weapons blessed by tribal shamans, supplies that could sustain him through weeks of pursuit in the harshest terrain on the continent. But the most significant discovery was Running Bear's war shield, painted with symbols that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. As Eloy lifted the ancient artifact, visions flooded his consciousness, memories of every Apache warrior who had carried this shield into battle, their courage and sacrifice flowing into him like strength drawn from a sacred well. "You carry the hopes of all who came before," the wolf's voice whispered in his mind, "not just for vengeance, but for the survival of our people. Hayes believes he can end our story, but he does not understand the power of spirits who refuse to be silenced." As night fell over Copper Ridge, Eloy made his final preparations. The war paint on his face had been renewed, with pigments running. Bear had prepared decades ago blessed formulations that connected him to the spiritual power of his ancestors. The lance felt perfectly balanced in his grip, while the shield bore protective symbols that had turned aside enemy weapons for countless generations. Jane appeared at his door with a final message from her contacts in Washington. "Federal marshals are being dispatched, but they won't arrive for at least a week. If Hayes proceeds according to his timeline, he won't live to complete it," Eloy interrupted with quiet certainty. "The ancestors have been patient for 20 years, but their patience has limits. Hayes thinks the mountains will hide his crimes one final time, but he's wrong. This time the Apache won't be taken by surprise." The wolf's howl split the night air, carrying across the desert like a battle cry from the spirit world itself. As the sound faded, Eloy felt the last connections to his peaceful existence fall away completely. The man who had fed chickens and lived quietly on the edge of town was gone forever, replaced by something older and infinitely more dangerous. Tomorrow, the final hunt would begin. The thunderstick lay across Eloy's knees as he prepared for the final confrontation, its carved wooden stock worn smooth by running bears' hands during countless battles. The ceremonial rifle had been blessed by Apache elders generations ago, its spiritual power evident in the intricate symbols carved along its length and the eagle feathers bound to its barrel with sinew blessed in sacred smoke. Dawn was breaking over the Sangre de Cristo mountains when Eloy and the wolf reached the high canyon where Hayes had established his base camp. Through the scope of a modern rifle, Eloy could see the systematic preparation for massacre, men positioning themselves at strategic points around the Apache settlement, supplies being distributed for an extended siege, weapons being checked. With professional thoroughness, Hayes himself stood near a command tent, studying maps while issuing orders with the confident authority of a man who had orchestrated similar operations dozens of times. His silver hair caught the early light as he pointed toward different sections of the Apache camp, dividing the killing field among his hired guns with clinical precision. The wolf's supernatural senses provided intelligence no human scout could have gathered. Through their spiritual connection, Eloy learned the exact positions of Hayes's men, their weapons capabilities, their patrol patterns, and most importantly, their psychological weaknesses. These weren't hardened cavalry veterans who had fought Apache warriors in honest combat. They were mercenaries accustomed to slaughtering defenseless families for money. Running Bear's spirit watches over this place. The wolf's voice echoed in Eloy's mind. But his protection requires a living champion to make it manifest. Are you ready to become the instrument of ancestral justice? The Apache families below remained unaware of the death that surrounded them. Children played in the morning sunlight, while their parents tended to daily tasks, trusting in the isolation of their mountain refuge to keep them safe from the violence that had consumed so many of their people. Their innocence would have been heartbreaking if Eloy had allowed himself to feel anything beyond the cold clarity of purpose that filled his consciousness. The attack began with Hayes' characteristic brutality, a coordinated assault designed to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. But this time, the Apache weren't defenseless refugees, caught without warning. This time, they had a guardian who combined traditional warrior skills with supernatural guidance and modern weapons training. Eloy's first shot took out the sniper positioned on the eastern ridge, the man's rifle tumbling into the canyon while his body remained motionless among the rocks. The thunderstick's report echoed across the mountains like the voice of ancestral thunder, announcing that the hunted had become hunters. The wolf moved like liquid shadow through Hayes's perimeter, its supernatural size and speed turning disciplined soldiers into panicking men who fired at phantoms. Where it passed, weapons jammed, horses bolted, and grown men found themselves paralyzed by primal terror that reached deeper than rational fear. "Blackhorse!" Hayes' voice boomed across the canyon, recognition and fury combining in a roar that revealed 20 years of suppressed guilt and rage. "I should have killed you at Devil's Canyon. You tried," Eloy called back, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. But the spirits had other plans. The battle that followed combined elements from different worlds, traditional Apache warfare tactics enhanced by supernatural intervention and modern military strategy. Eloy moved through terrain that seemed to reshape itself to aid his passage, while the wolf created chaos among Hayes' forces with displays of power that defied natural law. But Hayes wasn't entirely unprepared. Among his hired guns were men who had fought Apache warriors before, veterans who recognized the signs of spiritual warfare and responded with tactics designed to counter supernatural advantages. They spread out, used covering fire to limit Eloy's movement, and concentrated their efforts on reaching the Apache families before their guardian could prevent it. The thunderstick spoke again, its blessed bullets finding targets with accuracy that transcended mere marksmanship. Each shot carried the power of Running Bear's prayers, guided by ancestral spirits who had waited decades for this opportunity to balance the scales of justice. Federal agents appeared on the canyon's southern rim just as the battle reached its crescendo, their arrival perfectly timed through Jane's coordination with Washington authorities. But their presence only added another layer of complexity to a confrontation that had already moved beyond the realm of ordinary law enforcement. "This ends now, Hayes." The lead federal marshal's voice carried official authority, backed by government. "Power, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States." Hayes's response was predictable, a desperate gamble that revealed the true depths of his corruption. Rather than surrender to face justice, he ordered his remaining men to begin executing Apache prisoners, using their lives as bargaining chips in a final attempt to escape the consequences of his crimes. But he had made a crucial miscalculation. The wolf's spiritual mission wasn't just about punishing past crimes. It was about protecting Apache people from future harm. As Hayes' men moved toward the helpless families, they found themselves facing a supernatural guardian whose power had been building for 20 years. The confrontation was entering its final phase, and everyone involved understood that only one side would walk away from the canyon alive. The final confrontation took place where it had always been destined to occur, at Devil's Canyon, where Hayes' crimes had begun 20 years earlier. As federal agents secured the Apache families and arrested the surviving mercenaries, Hayes made one last desperate attempt to escape justice by fleeing toward the site of his original betrayal. Eloy pursued him through terrain that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy, the wolf ranging ahead with supernatural purpose. This wasn't just about one man's justice anymore. It was about closing a circle that had been opened by blood and betrayal, completing a pattern that connected past and present in ways that transcended ordinary human understanding. The ancestors' blessing flowed through Eloy like liquid fire, strengthening his aging body and sharpening his senses to supernatural acuity. He moved through the rocky landscape with the fluid grace of a man half his age, guided by instincts that had been honed by generations of Apache warriors who had fought impossible odds for their people's survival. Hayes reached the canyon rim, with his clothing torn and his political composure finally shattered completely. At 63, he was no longer the confident military officer who had orchestrated massacres with cold efficiency. Age and soft living had weakened him, while decades of guilt and paranoia had eaten away at his psychological foundations like acid. "You can't stop what I've started," he screamed across the canyon, his voice cracking with desperation. "There are others, Blackhorse, men more powerful than me, with plans that reach far beyond your comprehension." The wolf appeared at the canyon's edge, its amber eyes reflecting supernatural knowledge that made Hayes's threats seem pathetically small. In its gaze, Eloy saw the truth. Hayes had never been more than a tool, a useful instrument for corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and business. But tools could be replaced, and Hayes' usefulness had ended the moment. His crimes became public knowledge. "The spirits don't care about your conspirators," Eloy replied, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral authority. "They care about justice for the innocent lives you destroyed. Today, that debt comes due." Hayes drew his sidearm with hands that shook from more than physical exertion. 20 years of living with buried guilt had taken their toll, and facing the consequences of his actions had stripped away the last pretense of courage that had once made him dangerous. But as he raised the weapon toward Eloy, the wolf moved. With supernatural speed, the massive creature launched itself across impossible distance, covering the space between them in a single fluid leap that defied every law of physics. Hayes' shot went wild, the bullet ricocheting off stone, while the wolf's weight drove him backward toward the canyon's edge. For a moment that seemed to last forever. Hayes hung, suspended over the abyss, where his victim's bones lay scattered among the rocks. The wolf's jaws were locked around his gun hand, preventing him from firing while its amber eyes stared directly into his soul with judgment that had waited 20 years for this moment. "Please," Hayes whispered, all his political authority and criminal arrogance reduced to the desperate pleading of a man who finally understood the true weight of his sins. "I can make things right. I have money, influence, connections that could help your people." The wolf released him, not to grant mercy, but to allow justice to take its natural course. Hayes fell backward into Devil's Canyon, his scream echoing off the stone walls, before ending in the same silence that had claimed his victims decades earlier. The sound seemed to carry away more than just one man's voice. It took with it the weight of unpunished crimes, leaving the canyon feeling somehow cleaner than it had in 20 years. But the wolf's mission wasn't finished. As Eloy watched in amazement, the creature began to shimmer with ethereal light, its physical form becoming translucent as its spiritual nature finally revealed itself completely. The amber eyes that had guided him through his darkest hours held one final message of love and gratitude before the ancient spirit began its journey back to the realm of ancestors. "Justice is served," Running Bear's voice whispered through the desert wind. "The circle is complete. Our people are safe, and the guilty have faced the consequences of their choices. Rest now, my son. Your burden has been lifted." As the wolf's spirit faded into golden light that danced briefly among the canyon shadows before disappearing entirely, Eloy felt 20 years of guilt and self-doubt dissolve like morning mist. The survivor's shame that had haunted him since Devil's Canyon was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a warrior who had finally completed his mission. Federal agents arrived to find Hayes's body at the bottom of the canyon. His death ruled an accidental fall during an attempt to flee arrest. The official report would never mention supernatural intervention or ancestral spirits seeking justice. Such things had no place in government documents. But Eloy knew the truth. The wolf had come not for vengeance, but for completion. Running Bear's spirit had waited patiently for his chosen champion to accept his destiny, guiding him through the darkness until justice could finally illuminate the shadows where crimes had hidden for too long. As the sun set over Devil's Canyon, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and crimson, Eloy felt the presence of his ancestors settling into peaceful rest. Their long vigil was over, their people was safe, and the warrior they had trained since childhood could finally lay down his weapons and find the peace that had eluded him for 20 years. 6 months after Hayes's death, Eloy stood beside Running Bear's grave on the hill overlooking Copper Ridge, a simple riverstone warm in his weathered palm. The marker was modest, just a wooden cross with the old chief's name carved in both English and Apache script. But the power it represented had changed the course of history for his people. The aftermath of Hayes' exposure had sent shockwaves through territorial government and beyond. Federal investigations had uncovered the full extent of his criminal network, leading to arrests of corrupt officials from Arizona to Washington. The Apache lands stolen through his schemes were being returned to tribal ownership, along with compensation that would help rebuild communities devastated by decades of systematic theft. Jane had returned to the Smithsonian as something of a celebrity among historical researchers, her work on Hayes's crimes earning recognition as one of the most significant exposures of governmental corruption in territorial history. But she maintained regular correspondence with Copper Ridge, and her official reports carefully credited local Apache sources for providing crucial evidence, a diplomatic way of acknowledging Running Bear's spiritual guidance without mentioning supernatural intervention. "The stone completes the circle," Eloy murmured, as he placed the river rock at the base of the grave marker. It was a simple gesture, but one loaded with meaning that connected him to Apache traditions stretching back countless generations. The stone represented completion, acceptance, and the beginning of something new built on the foundation of what had come before. Doc Henderson approached from the path leading up the hill, his medical bag replaced by a walking stick that helped steady his steps on the uneven ground. At 73, he moved more slowly than before, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him both physician and philosopher to the entire community. "Heard you've been getting visitors," the doctor observed, settling onto a fallen log that provided a convenient resting spot. Apache families from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, asking about the man who saved them from Hayes's final massacre. Eloy nodded, unsurprised that news of his growing reputation had reached the doctor's ears. Word traveled quickly through Apache communities, carried by traditional networks that connected even the most isolated settlements. The story of the wolf spirit and the warrior who had avenged Running Bear's murder was becoming legend told. Around campfires, where tribal elders shared the history that would pass to future generations. "They want to learn," he said simply. "Young people who've lost connection to the old ways, elders who fear the traditions will die with them. Running Bear always said that knowledge shared is knowledge preserved." The transformation in Eloy's role had been gradual but profound. What began as occasional visits from curious Apache families had evolved into something approaching a formal teaching position. His small homestead now hosted regular gatherings where traditional skills were passed down: tracking, hunting, the spiritual practices that connected Apache people to their ancestral homeland. Martha had proven instrumental in supporting this evolution, her general store serving as an unofficial coordination center for the cultural preservation efforts. She maintained correspondence with Apache communities throughout the territory, helping families locate teachers and resources, while ensuring that Eloy's privacy was respected by those who sought his guidance. "The young ones especially need what you can teach them," she had explained during one of their regular conversations. "The reservation schools tried to strip away their identity, but you can help them find their way back to who they really are." Sheriff Coleman had been equally supportive, understanding that Eloy's new role served broader community interests. Apache families who felt connected to their heritage were less likely to turn to violence or despair, creating stability that benefited everyone in the region. The sheriff had even attended several of the cultural gatherings, his presence a symbol of how relationships between Apache and Anglo communities could evolve beyond mere tolerance toward genuine respect. The most profound changes, however, were internal. The guilt and self-doubt that had haunted Eloy for 20 years had been replaced by a sense of purpose that felt as natural as breathing. Teaching young Apache men to track game through difficult terrain, sharing the survival skills Running Bear had passed down, watching traditional dances performed by families who had feared their culture was lost forever. These activities filled spaces in his soul he hadn't realized were empty. Sometimes, during the quiet moments between teaching sessions, Eloy could swear he caught glimpses of amber eyes watching from the shadows. Never clearly enough to be certain, never long enough to prove the wolf spirit still lingered, but sufficient to suggest that some connections transcended the boundaries between physical and spiritual worlds. The federal compensation for Hayes' crimes had provided resources for rebuilding, but cultural revival required something deeper than money. It needed living examples of what Apache identity could look like in a changing world. Men and women who had survived the worst of their people's struggles while maintaining connection to their ancestral wisdom. As autumn approached, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of Running Bear's war paint, Eloy found himself planning winter gatherings that would focus on storytelling traditions. The young people needed to hear the old stories, not just as entertainment, but as guidance for navigating challenges their grandparents could never have imagined. The spirits worked through many instruments, he told the group of teenagers who had gathered around his evening fire. their faces reflecting firelight and ancestral wisdom in equal measure. Sometimes they choose warriors to fight battles that seem impossible. Sometimes they choose teachers to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Both are necessary for our people's survival. One of the young men, barely 16 but already showing promise as a tracker, raised his hand respectfully. "Elder Blackhorse, how do we know when the spirits have chosen us for something important?" The question brought back memories of his own youth, when Running Bear had provided similar guidance during his vision quest. The cycle of teaching and learning continued, each generation passing wisdom to the next while adapting ancient truths to contemporary challenges. "You listen," Eloy replied simply, "to the wind, to your dreams, to the voice inside that tells you when something matters more than your own comfort or safety. When that voice speaks clearly enough to change how you see your place in the world, you'll know the spirits have work for you to do." As the evening fire burned down to glowing coals, families began gathering their belongings and preparing for the journey home. But several of the elders lingered, their weathered faces thoughtful as they contemplated the cultural preservation efforts that were taking root throughout the territory. "Running Bear would be proud," one of them observed, using the Apache phrase, "that honored deceased teachers. His vision is bearing fruit in ways even he might not have foreseen." Walking back toward his cabin under stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, Eloy reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. The quiet homesteader who had once hidden from his past had become a bridge between worlds, helping his people navigate the space between traditional ways and modern necessities. The new beginning stone he had placed on Running Bear's grave caught moonlight as he passed, its simple presence a reminder that endings and beginnings were often the same moment viewed from different perspectives. His burden as a warrior was complete, but his role as a keeper of Apache wisdom was just beginning. In the distance, carried on the desert wind, came a sound that might have been the howl of a coyote, or the whisper of ancestral voices expressing satisfaction with work well done. Eloy smiled, understanding that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some connections too sacred to be examined too closely. The past had finally made peace with the present, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten trail waiting for the footsteps of those brave enough to follow where the spirits led them.